Okay, so welcome everybody. Last one to get here. I want to tonight we're going to talk about the history and the spread of Buddhism. And I just wanted to pick up two things from last week. Doug used a phrase entering the stream, and someone said, "What does that mean?" And I found it in the introduction to our book. It's defined. And it says, when a person catches a glimpse of ego's confusion and connects this with an aspiration to awaken, he or she is entering the stream of the Dharma. So it's not just being exposed, it's also being exposed and sort of hooked a little bit. Another note from last week, Mick did some research with AI about the history of monasteries. And it does seem that the Buddha invented that system, which is really amazing to me. Of course, other religions adopted it. Christians started building monasteries about 300 years after Christ, which would have been 800 years after Buddha. So obviously it works. People use it as a system. So the main point I want to share tonight is that Buddhism is alive and continues to evolve through time and across space. It is an open system responsive to the conditions where it is adopted. So what I mean by an open system is that ultimately the individual is the authority in this. What works for you, what do you believe out of it and all that? And it's not, there's not this, like you have to sign on the dotted line. So it's, instead of a thing that you have to believe in, it's a system for inquiry. It's a practice of inquiry. It's almost like a scientific model for research, right? And it is supposed to lead each person to their own conclusions, their own enlightenment. So there's a natural tension in that way between this individualness of it and the need to preserve the original teachings and pass them forward through time. So we don't want to pervert or dilute the teachings the way they were given to us, but at the same time, we need to make them personal. So that automatically creates a kind of a tension, which we can see, through the history. So, imagine communities forming and studying, working together, and somebody has a different idea and leaves, and suddenly there's two communities, right? And there's some tension between them. But always they're also always the same. They always have the same core beliefs and process. And during his time, Buddha deliberately developed, as we saw, a structure to support individuals on this path, but within a community that was working on living together in harmony. And so this structure had the benefit of actually preserving his teachings, because always in every generation, there are people who want the whole real thing and they keep it and they protect it and pass it forward. Last time I shared a quote about Buddha's original monks, that this writer said they were like goldsmiths working on themselves to become more fully polished. You could see them sort of hammering away at their gold to see what would come of it. And if we consider that the Buddhist path is actually like a craft or a set of skills, you can see that each person transforms their own raw material into something more polished. And consequently, this process produces a wonderful array of people. You don't have factory-made cookie cutter. We aren't all walking around, spouting the same things and stuff. We have all these like wide variety of people that are genuine Buddhists. Now, his followers tried to preserve the system that was working for all of them so well after his death. They gathered to consider what he had taught them and to establish what the book calls an authoritative version of his teachings. And they kind of went, what was that? They sat down and go, what was that? And they agreed on some things. And then with that agreement in hand, they set out to do what Buddha himself had been doing, which is to walk around, talk to people, and establish monasteries, accept people into their monastic order. What the book says of this period is, it says, quote, as the Dharma spread to different parts of India, differences emerged. And when you're sharing an essentially open system that blends personal responsibility with the structure of ethics and doctrine, the emergence of differences is probably inevitable. So I want to look at pause for a second and look at a modern example of how differences emerge as people try to replicate the original Buddhist model and teachings, but in a new context. And I want to talk about the San Francisco Zen Center, which was among the first Zen centers in America. Suzuki Roshi was a very traditional Zen monk living in Japan. And in 1958, Japanese immigrants living in San Francisco paid for him to come and live there because they wanted him to help them preserve their Japanese language, food, and traditions, including Zen. So they were definitely of the mindset of keep it pure. That's what they were actually really trying to do. So what happened, though, Americans heard that he was there, and they asked him to teach them about Zen and especially how to meditate. And they started sitting for hours with him before going to work and at the end of every day. And so he went to night school to learn how to speak English so he could talk to them. In his book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is still the best-selling Buddhist book of all time, is essentially a transcription of those talks that he gave to those American students. And we have an excerpt of it in this book, which we're going to read. But what resulted is that he ended up with two constituencies, essentially. First, the Japanese lay people who were accustomed to the monastic model, where monks did all the heavy lifting, they'd studying and meditating, and lay people supported them financially, and that was what they wanted. They didn't meditate, they didn't study the Dharma. I mean, they might have a little shrine at home and light a candle, but they weren't serious Buddhist practitioners themselves. And now, for the first time, the Westerners essentially wanted the same teachings and practices as monastics, but without the monastic setting. So they were demanding a very new form of Buddhism, which is, by the way, what we have in the West now. We don't have a lot of monasteries. We have a lot of people that are reading books and practicing and studying on their own. And before we go forward, I just want to pause and think for a minute about the conditions that were happening at that time. A lot of these people had been at war, had been soldiers in Korea or Japan, likely exposed a little bit to at least imagery of Buddhism, but certainly some exposure to it. So they were curious. They were also kind of outsiders. We know from reading the story of the poets and what are those guys called?
Beats. Jack
The
Kerouac.
Beats, yeah, Jack Kerouac and those guys, right? So we know, I think about them, they remind me of the people we met in when Buddha started teaching, and he went to Deer Park, and there were all these people there, and his friends, but also all these other people who were seekers. who were just wandering around saying, what can I find that will help me? And that's what these people were like, right? They were primed for Buddhism. They were eager for someone to help them understand it. And so, like the Buddha, Suzuki Roshi decided to teach them and give them whatever they needed. And so I just think of that as a really good example when we look back through history to think about this thing that started in northern India and landed, in Japan or Cambodia, or Bhutan, how it had to morph. It did morph every time to meet the needs of the people in the times that it was in. And even in India, it continued to morph. We saw that in the book, again, because times changed, needs changed, different parts of India were different. And so that kind of bubbling and stewing and everything, somehow the core is preserved, but the soup tastes different everywhere you land. So right now, very few Westerners become monks, but maybe in a couple of 100 years, we'll have monasteries all over America. Wouldn't that be something? So I want to pause and see what you think so far. Comments, questions? Yeah.
We do have monasteries. There's not a.
Oh, yeah. But it's not the primary model.
No.
They're really not like how many, because I know we've got a challenge up north, but they're really not very deep.
Not in Arkansas.
No, I just figured elsewhere.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, I mean, there's it's famous in the Theravada world. The Bayagiri is out in California, and there's some other Theravada monks. So if you really want to be a monk,
yeah, you can do it.
You can go do it.
No, you can do it. Pema Chodron has a monastery up in Canada, and there are places, but it's just that out of the 1,000 Buddhists, 1 or 2 of them are monks.
You have a monastery near every urban center, right? So you could go contact the tradition.
Well, maybe we will just give it a.
What's the one that's outside of Mount Baldy in California? Is that the so there's, I don't know if you all know who Leonard Cohen is, but he's a musician.
Yeah.
Was a musician. But anyway, he spent some years at Mount Baldy.
Yeah.
So
there are several in California. California's got more than we do. And there are a bunch of them in other, like New England, there's a bunch, Boston area, Vermont, but we do have a place here. What we don't typically have, like we have a place up here in Jasper, actually, with a Tibetan Lama, but there are no, there's a nun living there, or near there, but it's just much more loosely organized. And there's a sort of, you have to have a certain number to really sustain a monastery. But people do often go to retreat centers like, well, we'll see as we look more at Buddhism.
Since we're listening, and let's not forget Magnolia Monastery, Thich Nhat Hanh. Let's forget the name of the town because it's also.
It's in Batesville, Mississippi.
Yes, okay.
But the thing is that, okay, so those are Vietnamese monks and nuns for the most part. I don't know if Americans are actually in the monastery with them or if it's just an outpost essentially of something. But so the point about evolution, right? The point about movement and change and responsiveness. But let me go back and talk about this authoritative version of Buddhism that his followers adopted in that first meeting. And it has 3 parts is what they came up with. And you read about this in the book too. The Tripitaka or Tripitaka. The first one is Vinaya, or discipline. It's Vinaya in Sanskrit. And those are the rules of discipline for monks and nuns. The Dharma talks that the Buddha gave were memorized and written down, and they're called sutras. And the third part is an analytical synopsis of the teachings called Abhidharma. And I believe that might have been added a little bit later, but basically it's considered one of the baskets these days. And I understand this Abhidharma, the word literally translates as concerning the teachings. It's sort of like a step back, it's an abstraction from the words of the Buddha to what does this mean? And I think of it as kind of like the science of Buddhism. It's an analysis of how everything works based on what the Buddha saw and taught. So one source that I saw called it a systematic account of sentient experience. And so that's why I call it the science of Buddhism. And it, includes philosophy and psychology. And anyway, so at that time, so they settled on that, but then they kept moving around and teaching it, and these communities were forming. And times were changing, the places they went to were different. And so 100 years after the first council, a second assembly was held to work out some of the differences among these different Indian communities. And at that time, by then, there were 18 different schools. That's in 100 years. It's a lot. All of them considered themselves to be part of the Buddhist family and were accepted by such as the others. And they were all still employing the monastic system of teaching, living together, traveling together, and monks from the different schools often traveled and lived together. So it was very friendly. And that tolerance continued for another 100 years ago. They just worked on it, but they didn't pick one over the others until about another 100 years later, when King Ashoka stepped in and assembled a third council. And that's where he endorsed the school that became known as Theravada. And other schools still kept operating, but they didn't have the endorsement and support of the king. And some of them went on to morph into other things that we do still have now. But it was he who really, the book calls it, created a quantum leap in the spread of Buddhism because of his support. He paid for people to go out and take it to other countries. And they went first to Sri Lanka, which is also called Ceylon, or it's called Ceylon. And this is the form of Buddhism that still exists, mostly that form in Southeast Asia, in Burma, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, Java, Sumatra. We call it Southern Buddhism because these places are all south and east of India. And here at EBS, we have Doug's Theravada group, which is representative of that. Meanwhile, Ashoka had his time and people after him had their time, but Buddhism continued to evolve in India during and after his time. The book describes developments leading up to the fourth council about 400 years after Ashoka. It's not a fast evolution, but it's happening. And 600 years after the death of the Buddha. And by then, major new commentaries had been written that established the way of a bodhisattva, which is what we now call the Mahayana, or the Great Vehicle. And I'm going to read from the book for a second. The most visible manifestation of the Mahayana was a new wave of sutras and scriptures claiming to be the words of the Buddha that had remained hidden until then in other realms of existence. The Mahayana replaces the ideal of the Arhat with that of the Bodhisattva. Whereas Arhats sought to end confusion in themselves in order to escape samsara, Bodhisattvas vowed to end confusion in themselves, yet remain in samsara to liberate all other sentient beings. With Mahayana, The vision of spiritual life broadened beyond the controlled circumstances of cloister and study to include the wide open situations of the world. Correspondingly, the notion of Buddha was no longer limited to a series of historical personages, the last of whom was Shakyamuni, but referred also to a fundamental, self-existing principle of spiritual wakefulness or enlightenment. That's a big leap from one guy, and then maybe 3,000, 5,000 years later, another guy or gal, to a world awash with Buddhas, potentially. Anyway, so I think it might be possible to understand the different Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana by looking at the ultimate achievements of each path. So we start with ordinary people like you and me who have had little or no exposure to Buddhism. We are called wanderers because we're untamed, driven by confusion, and enduring birth after birth in the world of suffering known as samsara. We're people riding untamed horses. Carrying us along. That's a reference. Anyway, Theravada has these arhats, who are sometimes called non-returners, because they achieve complete liberation from confusion in this lifetime and will not be reborn into this world again. And all the schools see arhat as a very real ideal achievement. Nobody disses the idea of an arhat. Mahayana, though, introduced a new figure, a bodhisattva, who could be a non-returner, but instead pledges to come back for the sake of liberating everybody else who's stuck here. Bodhisattvas expect to be reborn countless times until everyone is free. It could be 1 billion lives, right? How long will it take to empty out all of the wanderers? Vajrayana introduces another figure. We haven't read about this yet, but it's a Siddha, Siddha, who is a bodhisattva but with extra powers over the phenomenal world. Someone who likely has been reborn countless times already and is currently working in extraordinary ways to heal the entire world. And this idea is unique to Vajrayana schools, and you could think of them as wizards, because a lot of the native cultures that Tibetan Buddhism thrived in were shamanistic, and so it's a natural development for them to have these people who can talk to the clouds and manage the mountains and stuff like that. Buddhas are understood differently according to the different traditions. Only a few Buddhas like Shakyamuni have ever existed, and we're waiting for the next one to appear. This is what the book attributes to the Theravadins. Or, Buddha nature is a fundamental self-existing principle, something that has always existed in this world and each of us, and therefore the world includes countless Buddhas among us all the time. This is the view of the Mahayana, including the Vajrayana. So, okay. Now, continuing with the spread for a minute, the Mahayana is what swept north and east through China, Japan, Korea, and Tibet and Mongolia about 500 years after the Buddha. Some people call this Northern Buddhism, and it includes the same doctrines as Theravada, but adds the ones that evolved later in India. The last school described in the book is Mantrayana or Vajrayana, which developed in the 8th to 12th centuries in India and is currently the main form in Tibet, Mongolia, and Bhutan. So in terms of time, you have mainly Theravada for about 250 in India, 250 to 300 years. Then Mahayana comes along and spreads north from about 700 to 1100 in the Common Era. And then Tantra, Mantrayana, Vajrayana begins to dominate in India, and it's exported north, mainly to Tibet. So I'm not going to say a lot. We'll look at all of this in much more detail, obviously, but like the Mahayana, this is from the book, the Vajrayana was based on a class of scriptures ultimately attributed to the Buddha known as Tantras. Vajrayana regarded the Hinayana and Mahayana as successive stages on the way to the Tantric level. The Vajrayana leapt yet further than the Mahayana in accepting of the world, holding that all experiences, including the sensual, are sacred manifestations of awakened mind, the Buddha principle. So not only do they see the Buddha as something everywhere, but they see everything as sacred. And they have this phrase, sacred world. So we're not going to go over all of this differences tonight. We'll have plenty of time to talk about them. But if you ask me, well, what's the real Buddhism? I would say it's the one you adopt as your own, whatever that is. So looking back at how it spread, we have at least two models. One is that a government adopted some form of Buddhism and provided financial support and protection. And that happened in many places. The other way is what we would call perhaps a word of mouth method, created by monks walking around and teaching. Circumstances and conditions arose, monks were there, people blended their monks' teachings into their own beliefs and took up the practice of Buddhism. And often they created a unique version that, as I said, was responsive to their times and culture. So right now, we're in the middle of Buddhism spreading in the West. It's less than 200 years since the first Westerners encountered the Dharma. And the earliest Westerners were scholars studying classic languages like Sanskrit, or anthropologists studying Asian culture, or philosophers. They were not taking up the practices themselves, nor were they learning it from teachers. So their understanding was limited, like people who study recipes and cookbooks but never actually cook meals. And this is commonly, so that was true until like when people like Suzuki Roshi started arriving, and you can go back and look at, it was mostly some in the 30s. I think in the 30s was the beginning of actual practitioners, actual teachers showing up here. I'm not real certain about the exact timeline, but there's these two different periods. There's this period when Buddhism was studied academically, scholastically, scholarly, and then it became practitioners. And that's when, people could actually get their hands around it and do it. And one of the very unique things about the West is that we basically, by the time it got here, it had fully evolved in all these other places. So we got this smorgasbord. If you lived in Sri Lanka, you got what came to Sri Lanka and stayed there and flowered there. And that's what you got. You didn't have to think about, well, is this Japanese version better than this Sri Lankan version or something? We do have that problem. We have everything all mixed up. And I mean, that's the most common thing people ask us when they come to EBS for the first time. They're like, where do I begin? It's just overwhelming. The other thing is that we are literate. We have been, and we are. We started having public education, in the West. And so we can read books, which was not true. I think in Tibet in the 1950s, something like 25% of the population could read. So the monasteries were where you went to be educated. And of course, you were educated in Buddhism, but also you learned how to read. Well, here we were already readers, and everything has been translated into English, which is amazing if you think about it. So we have obviously the internet and the global perspective. We can fly over to India and check it out, or Japan or whatever. And so we're sort of like in a tsunami of, right, of all this stuff. And so we have a different problem than people would have had before and in other places. But it's definitely a problem for us in a way because people are like overwhelmed. But we are literate. And the other thing is, we have a history of scientific inquiry and curiosity, and we had the Enlightenment here, our Enlightenment, our version of it. And so we are ready to pick up and chew on and, flex around with things, ideas and experiences and make them our own. That's just something we're already really well versed in doing. And so that makes us a different kind of population than the people in Japan might have been when Zen got there, right? So it makes sense to me that we're not in monasteries because we're not likely to say, well, I'll give my whole being over to you, Joe. You just aren't like that, we're going to be like, wait a minute, I'm figuring this out on my own. I'll let you know. So, but American Buddhists do tend to sample a lot of different traditions because they're here and they're available. And so if you look at anybody's household that's a Buddhist, they've got all the books from all the teachers, and they're usually weighing them against each other and stuff. And they go visit people and ask people, they'll tell you, yes, I've been to Japan a couple of times, or I've been to Tibet or Nepal or India or Southeast Asia, Vietnam. And so traveling to see the home country is a common thing if you can afford it. And then nowadays, since especially COVID, everything's on Zoom. So people are watching talks that people gave 40 years ago because they're now online and stuff like that. So it will be very interesting to see how Buddhism ultimately evolves in the West. And it's not finished evolving. One of the teachers that comes here, Anam Thupten, he's a Tibetan. He's he's 50. I don't know, close to that. He's in that age range. But he says that he and his Lama friends sit around and talk about us. And they say, who are these people? They don't know. They don't really know how to deal with us because we are different than what, like they encounter. And we're not monks, but we're not, lay people. And we're really so much more intently engaged than they're used to. And so how much, it's a question for them. How much do they give us? I know that they've had that debate among the Tibetans, which is the group I'm most familiar with. The first teachers that came here taught in Tibetan and had a translator. And the word was like, do we actually tell them this secret part or this, or do we keep they're not ready for this? Could they possibly handle it? And so, it's just a whole new thing. And I think they make the decision differently. Different teachers make the decision differently. Some of them lay it all out, some of them keep it back, make you go through certain preliminaries before they give you the secret stuff, which of course makes Westerners just like crazed, right? I want the good stuff. What do I have to do? Anyway, it's fascinating. I think it's fascinating, and it's wide open. And so I'm going to stop now. That's it for me. I want to know what you guys think, what your questions are. What do you think? Yeah.
So when you think about, I guess, the big three, right? Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana.
Don't forget Pure Land.
Say again?
Yeah.
Well, duh. You have to tell them about Pure Land, but Pure Land is a Mahayana version.
Yeah.
Okay.
It is. It's a Mahayana.
So it falls under
anyway.
that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So when you think about the big three, and if you had to describe to someone with like next to no exposure.
Yeah.
Like this.
Uh-huh.
A nickname. If you had to give each of them a nickname to help them think about the big difference, right, between each of them, what would you give?
Okay, well, first I need to apologize to Doug before I say anything.
Because the Theravadins, I mean, we are definitely like stick in the mud. Got this very old set of teachings, and we're just like, no, we're good, right over here in the dark, you know,
Yeah.
that's Theravada.
Yeah.
The way-
And so I've heard Tibetan teachers talk about it in their Vajrayana that, and by the way, let me say this. When Mick and I first started becoming Buddhists, we were taught Theravadan first. We had to do Theravadan for about 7 or 8 years before we were introduced to the Mahayana. And we had to do that for a while before we were introduced to the Vajrayana. So it is not like the Tibetans ignore the Theravadan. But what a Tibetan teacher would tell you is that you work on what you need to work on. And the real power and strength of the Theravada is self-liberation. So if you're you're struggling in the world, you can't help anybody if you're struggling yourself. And we're all struggling. We all start out confused and sad and crazy and right and blind. The question is, where is your confusion mostly? So the people that gravitate towards Theravada or basic meditation practice, are helping themselves because they need it. Then the Mahayana, if you're a person, and a lot of the people in the Mahayana are social workers, therapists, medical teachers, school teachers, nurses. I mean, we have one of our biggest groups is a Mahayana group following Thich Nhat Hanh, and they're all like that. They're like social workers and nurses, and because they're working with other people, and the tools in the Mahayana are about working skillfully with other people, because that's the work. The work is to stay and help everybody get forward. So the practices in Mahayana have to do with generating loving kindness, really appreciating how we have a practice called exchanging self for other, where you put other people's needs ahead of your own to help you diminish your attachment to your own happiness, right? You work on that. So it's a whole different set of skills. And you do have to be somewhat stable in your own life in order to go there, And then Vajrayana, I don't know what attracts us to Vajrayana, honestly. Poetry, magic, but also in Berkeley, where we came from, Mick and I, which was a Vajrayana center, there were all these high-level physicists working in Berkeley, the university, that would come over and they wanted to talk about matter and space and cosmology and stuff like that. And Vajrayana goes there. It does. It's like, let's talk about how the world works, because again, they're wizards. They're like, now I'm going to get trouble with Mick. Or maybe someone else, maybe Anna, but I'm saying that there's this engagement with the whole world, all of it, including outer space, including atoms and particles, and how they work and everything. And that just doesn't appeal to everybody. It appeals to certain people.
That helps, thank you.
Okay.
Can I add
Yeah.
slightly different angle? A couple of things. I'd let Doug speak for the Buddhist tradition. But in terms of Mahayana and Vajrayana, I think to me, what happens too is it starts utilizing the psychology of humans to dualize their reality, so, and we're all all three are kind of reducing self-clinging and ultimately like realizing there's really nothing solid that you need to defend, that kind of thing. So that's the core. And so as the schools developed, there was a kind of understanding that by putting others before you, psychologically, it's a very powerful methodology of reducing your self-clinging. Now, I mean, I think the old school really works on the mind and personal experience and watching that very closely so that you understand that there's no reason to cling. And this is sort of an extension and methodology that and so forth. So, and Vajrayana really starts pushing into the boundaries of faith, actually belief, but belief, empty belief. So we'll get to this point where we're talking about the emptiness of self and the emptiness of other and so forth. And then if you have that, what are you believing in? What is your faith in? Well, it's actually a very useful human impulse. And so I myself feel like there's a real part of that. I rebel against having faith in something, some woo-woo kind of thing. And yet here I am in the thick of it and getting a kind of a different view. I think maybe theistic religions are kind of, a lot of probably theists do this too, understand that this is really like useful to get out of self-clinging. But Vajrayanists are very clear about, and it's all imaginary. It's hard. It's hard.
No, but let me refine that a
Yeah,
little bit if I can.
Yeah. Make some bold.
So, because all of them, it turns out if you look at them, all of the practices of Buddhism deal with capacities we already have as humans and habits that we already have as humans. So when we talk about learning to settle yourself and be present, you already know how to do that. You just don't do it very well, and you just don't do it very consistently. So you can train yourself to do it better and more purposefully. And then when you're settled, you can do other things that you couldn't do if you were unsettled. Likewise, we can be generous. We are naturally compassionate, but we also have these selfish tendencies. And so we have to train our natural compassion. And what Vajrayana takes is our natural capacity to imagine, to dream, to create realities. So I always think about, I am walking around in my own movie all the time. There's almost a soundtrack playing in the background, right? Here is Cheryl, blah, 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 blah. She's doing da, 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 da. And so what Vajrayana does is it takes that habit of making up stories, making up ideas about myself, making up a world really, and says, here, take this one that we've been making, people have been making this one for 1,000 years. How about if you look at this one? And it teaches you to release the one that you do unconsciously and become aware of the process of doing it in a way that you never were before. And so I spend my time now, my practice right now is visualizing this whole world with a figure in the middle. It happens to be Tara, and she has certain qualities and all that kind of, so it's a Tara instead of a Cheryl. And I'm looking at how Tara, and it's like all of this works to undermine my attachment to my own movie script. But at no point do I actually think, Tara's going to walk in the room or save me or anything like that. There's no theism involved.
That was immensely helpful.
What?
That was immensely helpful.
Yes, sir.
That
what
discussion was
That
very.
question and that response was really
It's-
helpful.
Oh,
All of that
okay.
discussion, yeah.
Okay, well, good. That's why we're here. But it's like I've been
Are you okay?
Oh, go.
No.
Question on the screen.
Oh, there's someone on the screen where, Who,
I have a
was
quick
there a
question.
question?
Yeah, Cheryl.
No.
This is Laura. Hey, I have a quick question about the Dalai Lama.
No, I guess not. Doug, did you want to say
Oh, I was
something?
just gonna say that there's a lot of things we discussed that I will probably talk about later, but for tonight, Buddhism has its own way of understanding what the teachings are and what their purpose is and sort of what they mean. Because the interesting thing about Buddhism is you know, even in Theravada Buddhism, or I should say, not even in Theravada Buddhism. I won't belittle it myself. I'll let everyone listen. So, but the Buddha gave his teaching. He compared Buddhism to a raft. You know, and so you know, you're stuck on the side of the river and you're suffering, and the good stuff is all on the other side of the river. I've got to get across the river, and so what do? I find a raft, or I make a raft, or whatever. Because Buddhism, you find a raft, you know, and so you get across the river, and then you know when you get to the other side, are you going to say, oh, so glad to be here. I'm going to put this raft on my back and carry this raft around for the rest of my life because I'm so thankful. No, you leave the raft by the shore, you're done. You know, and he says this is what the teachings are. The teachings are a skillful means to develop your mind and yourself to this place. And once you're enlightened, once you arrive at this destination, you're not a Buddhist anymore. You know, you're done. You graduated. You know, and so the teachings are just a means.
Yeah.
And so if you look at it that way, it's like, well, sure, you've got Theravada and Vajrayana in every country Buddhism goes to. That there's this different set of sort of a different flavor for what gets emphasized, and they come up with new teachings to deal with specific issues, you know, in that society. But because it's not the teachings themselves, that's not what's most important. You know, that so if we lost all the teachings of Buddhism, that would be tough.
I wouldn't like that.
But well, you know, we
Yeah,
wait
yeah.
for Buddha, but they can be recreated because they're all just potentials within the human mind.
Yeah.
You know, and so what else was I going to say? Oh yeah, so you know that's the thing, and I had this discussion a lot because Theravadins are obsessed with the Pali Canon, with the Theravada teachings, and it's like, oh, we've got to, you know, unpack every word and all the cross references, and it's very scholarly and absurd, you know. And I'm always telling people this is not the important part.
Yeah.
You just have to understand it well enough that you understand it for yourself, because you know what Buddhism says is the truth is something that the wise know for themselves. It's not written down. The teachings of Buddhism are not the truth. The truth happens in your own mind when you understand the teachings. And it doesn't matter what flavor of the teachings work for you. It's like you're trying to start a fire, and it's like, do I have a big lighter or a flint and a rock? I guess that's Theravada, you know, or rub the stick and the thing. It doesn't matter how you start the fire. You just got to get it started.
Yeah.
You know, and that's what all of the teachings are about. You know, and so that story is in Theravada, and there's plenty of in Mahayana, like it's the Lotus Sutra, right, or the three vehicles, this idea that there's all these different ways that get people on the path. That's what's important.
Yeah.
So, you know, when you look at it and say, what do I do? What do I do? Find what appeals to you and start there. You know, you say it's a problem, but to me it's a solution. It's like we have every form of Buddhism in the world is you know,
available.
Here in the United, it's on the internet, it's in the United States, you can find good teachers for anything. And so whatever speaks to you, whatever calls to your heart, you know, and you say, wow, I think, you know, that really sparked something. I want to learn more about this. That's your path.
And you might have different ones at different points in your
Right.
life.
Absolutely.
So people do this one and then they move on to something else. Thank
So
you.
that was my son.
Thank you,
Sounds
Doug.
okay.
Hey, Cheryl.
Thank you, Doug. Good.
Cheryl.
We have to talk about emptiness, and I dread talking about emptiness, but we have to talk about it. And it's so, I mean, Sonny asked the question, why would you want to go in the void or whatever empty?
Oh, to disappear. I mean, that's what it sounds
To
like, right?
disappear.
It's nihilism, you know.
Yeah,
This is a common
yeah,
complaint about Buddhism.
yeah. And it is like, if we go back to the introduction to the book and what they said about what Buddhism is about, the whole thing is about clearing away your own confusion. So you could, the very simplest level, you could say that your mind is not your confusion. It's empty of your confusion. And the analogy they use, the metaphor is a sky with no clouds. That's what they mean by empty. Now, the sky is not empty, empty. There's sunshine, there's air, there's all that stuff. There's life. But it's not covered over. And what is covering over everything for us? Two things. One is that we're afraid. We know we're mortal. And there's this underlying churning fear of ceasing to exist. And so we're constantly trying to cover that over with ideas about, oh, well, I'm this, I'm that, I'm this and that, and decisions about things and so forth. And then the other thing is just habitual patterns is what people call it. And where, like I have a sister who was always mad as hell at everything. And I was always trying to make peace with everybody. And so we'd go on a vacation and she would be fighting with like the bus driver and then the ticket agent at the airport and then the stewardess, and I'm like sailing through and people are like, oh, come on, and it was like that's what they mean by that. They mean that she's not actually angry at everybody. Oh, that's not who she is. It's a habit that she's created. And this process helps us break through those habits, and step back from them and sort of, well, reconsider, what's real, what isn't real. And so the word emptiness that we're going to talk a lot about as we go through this course means that things are empty of those assumptions you've made about them, or those conclusions you've drawn, or those concepts you've created. So, and that issue of emptiness is all the way through everywhere, all the schools. So, maybe that's it for tonight. I don't know. Yeah, Nathan, do you want to say something?
I was just
Whoops,
trying
wait
to
a minute.
help get you.
Can't
I
hear
think
you.
Laura had a
Hold on.
question.
Go ahead, Nathan.
So actually, it was my question, Cheryl, but it can wait till the next session.
Shoot. Why can't I hear you? I can't hear you.
Is
I
it can
just
wait.
turned up my volume. Let me look. I can't hear you, Nathan. Try again, speak again.
Can you hear me now?
I've been the chat.
I don't, yeah, maybe you can type something in the chat. I'm so sorry, Nathan. I don't know what's going on. I'm not sure. They cannot hear. I was trying to get help. Oh. Laura has a question. Okay. So I don't know what the problem is, and I need to figure it out because we need to hear from you guys, but we can't hear you right now. I've got
No
my
worries.
volume turned up.
Yeah, no worries.
You got your speaker set to PC or whatever.
Well, let me check that. Let me just check that. Sound audio settings.
With
Speaker. Oh, the speaker here. Hold on. Okay, Nathan, try again, please.
No, this is Laura. But this can wait. This can wait till next week. Okay.
We hear you now. We have 5 minutes. So
Okay.
I want to
Well,
hear
it was
all your
was
questions.
a really quick question about the Dalai Lama because of Rajananya. I'm pronouncing that wrong. The Tibetan was one of the later schools or traditions.
Yeah.
How did the Dalai Lama come about being one of the later ones? I always presumed it was one of the first ones.
Well, he's still a long time ago. The tradition started, Tibet got Buddhism in 2 waves, but the first wave was about 700 in the Common Era, 700 in the Common Era. And around that time, I don't know exactly when the Dalai Lama tradition began, but it was that long ago. So it's generations. He's the 14th. And he's 90 or whatever, so 1400 years or something. Nathan, what did you want to tell us?
I didn't have a question. I was just I didn't know if all the mics were working or not, so I was just trying to get your attention for Laura's question.
Oh, for Laura, okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Well, does anybody have anything they want to say? Zoomers? No?
I did have one question now that we're
Okay,
now that we're
okay.
on. Okay, okay. Uh, there was a part where it talks about, it says the cushion, run where you were reading, where it was talking about the different, or before it switched from the Arhat to the Bodhisattvas.
Yes,
Right before that, it was talking about the movement, and it said the Kushan Empire also saw the flowering of Gardharian art, which under Hellenistic influences produced Buddha images of extraordinary nobility and beauty. Does
mhm,
anybody know anything about that? I thought that was very
Yeah,
interesting.
in the Kandahar area, there's this Greco-Indian area where those two cultures mix together, and yeah, that. I mean, really, a lot of people think that's where making statues of the Buddha started,
Mhm.
because originally you didn't make a statue of the Buddha. The Buddha was represented by an empty chair or the wheel of Dharma.
right,
But one theory is once these Greco-Roman Indian types started making these beautiful Greek-looking statues, that it kind of spread, and of course the statues evolved and began to look more characteristic of, the statuary in their homelands.
yeah.
But yes, they're very beautiful. The Buddha
Yeah.
statues in the Kandahar area, I think that's what it is.
Okay, I actually spent some time in Kandahar, so that's even more
Oh,
interesting.
I think I'm saying the right place.
Okay, well,
Oh.
I'll look into Kandahar Buddhist art because
Yeah, and just Greco-Roman influenced Buddha statues. There's plenty out there on that.
okay.
anything else? So, next week Doug is gonna teach and he's gonna talk about
The
the,
graduated path,
The graduate-
generosity, ethics, and renunciation. I don't know if we're gonna talk much about renunciation. We'll definitely talk about generosity and ethics and how that fits into the path. The sort of the way the Buddha talked to worldly people like us. He
Mhm.
didn't start talking about esoteric stuff. He started very basic.
So I wanna say that he's not hewing to the book quite as loyally as I have,
No, that's fair statement.
but. But he's been looking at this stuff and that period, the Theravada period, more than anybody I know. So, I mean, we're really lucky that he's willing to come talk to us about that. And after he does that, we're gonna go back to the book, but we're gonna jump to the question of karma. So he'll be next week, and then the 2 weeks after that, we're gonna talk about karma, which necessitates talking about emptiness of self or whatever. We have to start getting to that emptiness question. So, and
Independent
then
origination.
dependent
It's
origination.
scary bugaboo.
And then, so really right into the heart of it all, but, so feel free to read whatever you want in the book. Honestly, we're not like going through, let's not get chemistry class or something, we get in trouble if we read ahead. But, yeah, and then we'll take a break for Thanksgiving and then we'll do something in December, we don't. But, all right, well. I'm gonna do my little dedication prayer. I keep promising to send it to you and I forget. But this is from my teacher, Chucky Nemo Rinpoche. And we use it at the EBS board meetings too. It goes like this: the teacher has appeared in this world, and the teachings have illuminated it like the light of the sun. May the holders of the teachings be in harmony like siblings, and may the goodness of the teachings remain for a very long time. So thank you for coming. You can help us put the room, set it up for what, Stephen. Nick need next class.
I was really looking at it right though.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's like, now looking at it, it's like, shit.
Bye, guys. I'm gonna end the meeting.
Good,
And it's like.
See you next time.
Very strange.
right. Not what you expect.
When I'm real